Hello and welcome back to my RC channel. I'm Andy RC and today I'm going to be taking a look at the Eachine RedDevil. This model is basically the Happy Model Sailfly with a few things changed, and I wasn't completely sold on that model either. The biggest showstopper for the RedDevil and the Sailfly is the motor choice, whether they have Eachine written on the side or Happy Model. 1102 is the wrong stator size, and above 8000 kV is too high of an RPM. The RedDevil's 1102 motor is listed as having 8700 kV, which is an even higher kV than the 8500 kV of the Sailfly, although I'm not sure any of these motors have the correct kV listed on them anyways. So let me break it down. The RedDevil's dry weight is 37 grams, so it should be running off a 2S LiPo, but an 1102 stator motor at 8700 kV is not going to produce enough torque on a 2S voltage. Therefore, regardless of the kV, it's not going to reach high RPMs and will be sluggish. And that's because kV is measured without a load. So it's a bit like jacking your Prius off the ground, removing the tyres, giving it full throttle and saying, look, it's doing 150 miles per hour because the speedo says so. Does a Prius even do 150 miles per hour? I think some people say Prius as well, don't they? So they provide a 300 milliamp 3S high volt LiPo, thinking voltage will fix the problem, but it doesn't. By the way, it's a high volt and charging it to a high volt is only going to make things worse, so don't do that. You're not given a charger in the package either. So this 300 milliamp 3S LiPo is too heavy, giving the model an all-up weight of about 63 grams, which is borderline doubling the weight of the model. Then the higher voltage sends the RPMs the other way, which is too high and outside the tolerance of these 3 or 4-year-old prop design that bends easily under pressure, creating vibrations and inefficient thrust because it's trying to lift a whale of a model with that LiPo. You have to remember these props first appeared on a toy called the Rolling Spider, using brush motors with about 15 grams of thrust each. Go and watch my Sailfly review. I'll put a card up the top where 3 of these props flew off all at the same time just from a punch out, because it puts things in perspective how much pressure the higher voltage is putting under these 65mm props. You can't even remove them by hand, and they give you a prop remover so that you can do that. And it's the same with the RedDevil, but 3S is causing them to lift off by themselves. Now, people get creative, of course. For example, customers are applying nail varnish and adhesive to stop the props from flying off, and that is fair enough, but you shouldn't be having to do that, at least I don't think. So far, only Full Speed have got the motor choice right with their first toothpick. They used an 1103 motor at 8000 kV, which provides just enough torque to sustain the higher RPMs with this prop on a 2S. The only issue with the Full Speed toothpick is their poor range D8 receiver and the CMOS camera mounted in what can only be described as Giallo, but it's TPU. This would have been a perfect model if they had used a CCD camera instead of a CMOS camera, because it uses a different technology and you don't get rolling shutter issues with it. So speaking of Giallo, Eachine must have learnt from the trash can that if you take a Cadex EOS 2 and put it in the Mobula 7 casing, you can't just jam a load of foam underneath the camera and hope for the best, but sadly, that's what they have done here. Now, I appreciate the option of being able to change the camera angle, because on the Sailfly, the angle is too much and it can't be changed. But go and check out my video why we get Giallo from high-end CMOS cameras. They should have used the cheaper all-in-one camera that they used on the Sailfly, because it's less susceptible to Giallo despite it being a CMOS camera, but I guess it's just less sensitive to rolling shutter than the EOS 2 because it's cheaper and it's also an all-in-one, so it's got its VTX at the back. The RedDevil has a separate switching VTX up to 200 milliwatt via smart audio, but it's also got the Crazy Bee F4 all-in-one board where their SPI receivers are good for about 100 meters, so the 200 milliwatt VTX is a little bit wasted. By the way, on the subject of the built-in SPI receiver, it's best to mount the antenna up through the canopy, otherwise you'll get probably about 30 meters of range. This is something that I have learned over time with these Crazy Bee boards. Usually they have them sticking below the LiPo and you get a fail-safe straight away, but make sure you get them up in the air through the canopy like I have here, and you will get over 100 meters. There is one spare UART, so I guess you could add a longer range receiver, but so far everything seems to be a poor choice, even down to the frame, which bends like it's delaminated. I guess it does have weight on its side, so hopefully it won't split in a crash. The Crazy Bee board has been mounted upside down this time, with the only benefit being that you can access the JST connectors to the motors. Reversing the all-in-one board now means that you have to access the USB port from the underneath, therefore you have to remove the LiPo to access it. But it also means that you can't access the bind button or the bootloader button because the VTX is covering them up with a bunch of sticky back foam. So if you did need to get to those, you'd have to remove the canopy and also the VTX. Now at this point you're probably thinking, come on Andy, you're being really harsh. You can just use the bind command in the CLI from the Betaflight configurator, and you are right. But which command? Well, I'll tell you, because just like the Happy Model Sailfly, it's come flashed with a release candidate of Betaflight 4, so it doesn't work with the latest Betaflight configurator, which at the making of this video is 10.5.1. Now, Happy Model stepped up to the plate and provided a CLI dump on their website for the official release of Betaflight 4, but there's no official Betaflight CLI dump for the RedDevil, and it doesn't look like there's going to be either. So you have to roll back your configurator to version 10.4. And for those who aren't in the know, the release candidate of Betaflight 4's CLI bind command is just the word bind, and then you have to type save. But in the official release of Betaflight 4, the command is bind _RX SPI, so it's not as simple as you think to get it to bind using the CLI. So yeah, that was a fun 20 minutes, although to be fair, it does explain this in the manual, so as I say, I wouldn't expect a CLI update for this guy at all, and because I'm a man, I didn't read the manual, so it would have been a lot quicker if I had. Anyways, to be fair to them, the Betaflight setup wasn't too bad. I did note down a few things. Motor stop was enabled, air mode was turned off, as was anti-gravity, dynamic filters, and D-Shock commands were all turned off. I mean, the motors aren't going to be the loudest beacon, but there's no buzzer on this model, so it's better than nothing. I've kept their PIDs and rates as well as the OSD placement. I may have turned some of the warnings off. As for everything else, there is a piece of sticky back foam underneath the frame with one of the adhesive peels kept in place. I can see that coming apart over time, but they do give you a spare, and I wouldn't remove the pad as it's covering up a bunch of wires while at the same time keeping the 3S LiPo snug against its 3D printed holder. It's using the Happy Model XT30 connector with a built-in 100 microfarad 16 volt low ESR capacitor to try and smooth out the current spike that's been taken out the inferior 5 volt regulator. So far I've had no issues, but today is a new day with a higher kV motor, so we'll see what happens. You get given 2 cable ties, which are apparently for tying around the camera to reduce Giallo, but that's just not going to work. In fact, it's very tempting to remove the all-in-one camera that came from the Sailfly and install it into this. I mean, the camera connects directly to this board via a JST connector, but that wouldn't be a fair test of this model out of the box, so I'm going to keep it the same. Plus, I wasn't too fond of the Sailfly, despite the camera being a positive thing, so I will leave it as it is, and I have used the cable tie to stop this linear antenna ending up in the props because it just flops around. It's connected to the VTX via a micro UFL connector with no adhesive. So if that pops off, then it's curtains for the VTX. The model does come in a nice Eachine pouch, and you don't get that with the Sailfly. That just comes in a box. But you do get spares that are similar to the Happy model package. In total, you get 3 full spare sets of the 65mm prop. They are the ones modified to fit a 1.5mm shaft for the brushless motor. And when I reviewed the Sailfly, I was like, 3 full sets of props? That's awesome! Until I realised on the first flight that I lost 3 of them in a punch-out, which is when things started to make a lot more sense why they have provided 3 full spare sets of props. Then in a small bag we have got the foam pad that I spoke about earlier, along with a couple of spare screws and nylon nuts, as well as a small Phillips screwdriver and a prop remover. And you know, you really can't remove the props by hand, not easily anyways. I mean, you can twist them side by side and you will end up damaging the props in doing so. I think a comment that I got on my Sailfly review said, yeah, the props slowly rise up, so you have to make sure that they are pushed on properly for every flight. Well, that was its first flight. Maybe it didn't appear that way because I did the line of sight flight afterwards, but that's the magic of editing. So today I'm hoping I'm not going to lose the props in the air. However, the amount of spares I have here suggests otherwise. Okay, let's go for a line of sight with this chappy. It's a little bit breezy today and it's early in the morning, so I've got my back to the sun, but I figured this thing can't be that loud, so it should be okay to fly early in the morning. And it's very quiet, as all of these models are. That is what they are good for, very inconspicuous, of course. But let's see what the punch is like on it. So that little zinging sound that you can hear, those are vibrations, those are the props getting pushed too far and deflecting. It doesn't seem too bad line of sight, and for sure there is plenty of power, but especially on a sunny day you're gonna get loads of jello with that and inefficiency. But you can't help but notice these things fly great line of sight. Just that doesn't really translate into FPV. Well, I'm not hearing any oscillations or anything like that. Quite hard to hear anything though when the motors are this small. You really have to check how warm the motors are. It's funny because the canopy of this one is a better quality than the canopy of the Sailfly. I mean, it was just awful 3D print TPU quality, but the camera performed better. Funny enough, it was a lower quality camera which actually produced less giallo. Alright, maybe the dynamic range isn't as good, but I would prefer not to have giallo than have better dynamic range. But you know, everybody is different. Plenty of power with this guy, and it is deceiving. I mean, it looks smooth line of sight, but I've had this before, you know. That zinging noise, that is vibrations going through to the frame and making it through to that canopy and the camera. And also, you might not be able to see it, but sometimes in the FPV feed you can see the blades bend to quite some degree, and that's also creating vibrations and lack of thrust and things like that. And I think building one yourself, giving it the correct specs and the right motors, and maybe even better props, stiffer props. I know they are making stiffer props, but if that's the case, then, you know, you're gonna want to make sure that you've got the right motor set up. You don't want to over rev, you don't want the props to bend too much, because they are not doing their job at that point. So I actually had a flip of death at that point, and it looks like the thing has died. So I'm just going to plug the battery back in. Still got the transmitter going. All of the motor wires are connected correctly. So let's see what happens if I arm it. Yeah, looks like we have got an ESC failure. That back motor there is not spinning correctly, so could either be the motor, but it's more than likely the ESC, I would imagine. You can see it actually spins, but nah, the ESC is resetting there because it's recognizing a short, and you can see the motor doesn't know which phase to spin in. So to me, that is an ESC, and the ESC is failing. Now Eachine have actually made it quite easy for me to diagnose the issue here, because I can access the motor JST connectors from the underneath. So all I need to do is disconnect the working motor and disconnect the motor that isn't working, and hopefully the leads will reach. It might be a bit of a stretch, and you might be thinking, oh, you need to match the pins up, but because these are three-phase motors, then all the pins do is determine the direction of the motor, so we won't have a short. So essentially, if the motor turns as normal, then there's some kind of short that's happened in the motor. But if I get the same result out of this motor, in that it stutters and doesn't spin, then it is the ESC that is the issue. So the moment of truth, this might be tricky, because we have only got 3 wheels on our wagon, as they say. But I'm going to plug it in, so we are the opposite way around. So this is the motor at the back here that wasn't working, and I'm going to actually plug the battery in to give it a little bit of weight, otherwise I think it may just try and leap off the ground when I arm it. But if it is just a problem with the motor, then this front motor should spin, and it's the motor that has shorted. So I'm gonna try and be as quick as possible, but it may just flick back. But I am looking to see what happens with this motor. How about that? It's fine. Therefore the ESC is fine. So it's actually the motor that has failed in this instance, and not the ESC. So it's about 2 weeks later as I waited for my spare motor to turn up, and as you can see, I'm taking it very steady. We've got the throttle value at the bottom right of the on-screen display, and other than giving it a couple of blips of throttle, what I'm trying to do at first is emulate the amount of thrust that these propellers were originally designed for, which of course was not a lot on brushed motors. And as you can see, if you keep the throttle fairly low, they behave nicely. In fact, we have next to no jallow in the picture. Oh, and by the way, the Cadex EOS 2 camera is the 16:9 version, so be careful with that. If you do intend on buying this model, then you're going to want to be using 16:9 goggles ideally. But what I learned with this model is, look at that, 79% throttle, and I'm still able to do some nice acro maneuvers. You don't need 100% throttle to have fun with this guy. But really, I'm not giving it 100% throttle because in the back of my mind, I've got the sailflies props flying off, and then I've got the motor of this one burning up. But just look at this here. We are around about 67% throttle to dive this tree, so you don't need the full power to have a good time. But I do think the high kV of this motor is what caused it to burn up. I'm going to do another 80% throttle there to dive this tree and a little bit of jallow, and I think I go 100% throttle here. So that's what you get. You definitely do get jallow, and I'd rather it wasn't there, but you know, it surprised me a little bit. It wasn't debilitating. That being said, I'm not sure I would go 100% throttle a lot of the time with this model, considering what happened. I mean, it could have just been a defective motor, but you know, I'll leave you to decide that. You know, when you have a model like this, you are then scared to fly it, and that's not what you want. You want a robust model, really, that you can trust. But anyways, I'm not getting any interference through the electrical system, which is to be expected, really, because it's not drawing a huge amount of current. The current meter, by the way, has its scaling slightly wrong, so don't really pay too much attention to that. Also, I thought the tune was pretty good. We're getting a little bit of buffeting there, but because we've been having this nice weather recently, there's been a lot of wind that comes along with it. And I think it's the wind that is causing that buffeting, because it's not always there. Sometimes it's really smooth, and then all of a sudden you'll get buffeting. So I didn't want to mess with the PIDs, because it could be the case that on a calm day the PIDs are perfect. Giving it another 100% throttle there, and again we've got a little bit of jallow, but it's not too bad. You can see the wind pushing me towards the estate there. So yeah, that's how windy it is. It is a crosswind. So now I have to say, can I recommend this model? And it's a real difficult one. And that's what's great about a review. I'm not a big fan of this model, right? But I can put everything on the table here. You can look at the footage yourself. You can see my experience, and then you can decide for yourself if you want to buy it. Now, personally, I think I would build one myself that has got better specs. I'd probably choose an 1103 motor. I'd choose a setup similar to the full speed toothpick and change the camera, maybe make it a little bit lighter, and I go down that route. But you know, if you haven't got the time and you don't have any failures with this thing, then, you know, it is a viable option. I mean, what are we? You know, we're 4 minutes 21 in here. I mean, really, I should have landed because we're at 10 volts. That's when you should be landing on a 3S, but I just keep going, and now it's gone into 9 volts. You're going to be damaging your battery here. I'm doing this just to show you how long it flies for, I promise. Don't do this. But we've got 8 volts there, so yeah, it's time to land. So if you are interested, I will link to it in the description below, and as always, thanks so much for watching. Please continue to subscribe. Cheers.